Most people in the lobby never noticed the old man until he sat down directly beneath the company's gold-plated mission statement. Hartwell Infrastructure occupied 42 floors in downtown Chicago, and every inch of the building was designed to intimidate ordinary people before a single negotiation even began. Polished marble reflected cold white lighting. Security guards wore tailored suits instead of uniforms. Even the receptionist spoke with the careful confidence of people trained to make visitors feel smaller than the building around them. So when an elderly man in a weathered brown coat stepped through the revolving doors carrying a cracked leather folder, several employees assumed he had entered the wrong tower. Nobody expected him to ask for Daniel Mercer. Mercer was the company's chief executive officer, a man known throughout the construction industry for buying distressed public projects, restructuring them aggressively, and turning enormous profits before local governments could react. He rarely met anyone without a legal team present. His assistants screened every visitor weeks in advance. Yet the old man approached the reception desk quietly and requested a private meeting using the calm tone of someone placing an ordinary lunch order. The receptionist smiled politely at first. Then she checked the schedule. "Sir," she said softly, "Mr. Mercer does not accept walk-in appointments." The old man nodded once. "Please tell him Walter Green is here." She typed the name into the internal system. Nothing appeared. Her expression changed immediately. Corporate employees understood hierarchy better than empathy. If a name carried no visible status, the person attached to it usually became invisible too. "I'm sorry," she replied, already glancing toward the next visitor. "There's no record of you." Walter rested both hands on the leather folder. "I understand. But he'll want to hear why I came." Before the receptionist could answer, a group of executives crossed the lobby laughing loudly about a transportation contract recently awarded to Hartwell Infrastructure. At the center walked Daniel Mercer himself, perfectly tailored navy suit, silver tie clip, expensive watch visible beneath his cuff. He spoke while walking, barely acknowledging employees who moved out of his path. Mercer built his reputation on speed, intimidation, and calculated impatience. People feared delaying him more than disappointing him. Walter stepped slightly forward. "Mr. Mercer." The CEO slowed with visible irritation. His executives fell silent instantly. Mercer looked Walter up and down once. "Can I help you?" "I believe you can," Walter answered. "I came about the North River redevelopment contract." One of the executives laughed under his breath. The North River deal was worth nearly $300 million and involved a complicated partnership between the city, several private lenders, and Hartwell Infrastructure. News stations had covered the agreement for months. Hundreds of contractors wanted access to the project. Mercer gave a thin smile. "If you're selling consulting services, procurement handles outside proposals online." Walter remained calm. "I'm not selling anything." "Then you should probably leave my lobby." The surrounding executives smirked carefully, waiting for permission to laugh openly. Mercer had a habit of humiliating people publicly when he believed they wasted his time. Investors considered it confidence. Employees considered it survival training. Walter slowly opened the worn leather folder. Inside rested several yellow documents, neatly protected in transparent sleeves despite their age. "I only need 10 minutes, he said. Mercer barely glanced downward. "You people always say that." The phrase hung in the air longer than Mercer intended. Even the receptionist shifted uncomfortably. Walter, however, showed no anger. His face carried the steady restraint of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. "You people?" Walter asked quietly. Mercer checked his watch dramatically. "Men who appear without appointments holding old paperwork usually want money. My attorneys handle claims." "This is not a claim." "Then what is it?" Walter closed the folder carefully. "A contract." Several executives exchanged amused looks. Mercer finally laughed openly. "A contract with who?" "With your company," Walter replied. Mercer shook his head once. Hartwell Infrastructure was founded 12 years ago. Walter's eyes never moved. Not before the merger. For the first time, Mercer stopped smiling. A younger executive leaned toward him nervously. "Daniel, Your board call starts in 4 minutes. Mercer ignored him. Walter continued speaking calmly. Your father signed the original agreement in 1987, before Hartwell acquired Midwestern Transit Materials during the bankruptcy consolidation. The temperature inside the lobby suddenly seemed colder. Mercer's expression tightened almost invisibly. Very few people publicly mentioned his father inside the company. Charles Mercer had died before the merger became nationally profitable, and Daniel rarely discussed the early years of the business. Investors preferred the myth of a self-made executive. You're mistaken, Mercer said flatly. Walter slid one document partially from the folder. I don't believe I am. A security guard near the elevators adjusted his earpiece, waiting for instructions that never came. Employees crossing the lobby slowed their pace. Something inside Mercer's posture had changed, and corporate staff recognized danger faster than words. Walter noticed it too. He did not press forward aggressively or raise his voice. Instead, he placed the document back into the sleeve with deliberate care, like a man handling evidence already accepted by a court. Then he looked directly at Mercer and spoke the sentence that finally erased every trace of amusement from the CEO's face. The land beneath your North River project, Walter said evenly, was never legally transferred. Daniel Mercer did not react immediately, which in corporate negotiations usually meant he was trying very hard not to react at all. The executives surrounding him shifted uneasily while employees near the reception desk pretended to focus on their phones. Nobody moved. Walter Green stood quietly with the leather folder pressed against his chest, looking less like a threat than a retired schoolteacher waiting for a delayed train. Yet something in the lobby had changed. Mercer's confidence no longer controlled the room completely. That's impossible, Mercer said finally. Walter answered with the same measured calm. No, sir. Impossible things disappear when records are examined carefully. One of the executives stepped forward, attempting to rescue the situation. Mr. Green, if you have concerns involving property transfers, our legal department can schedule a formal review. Walter nodded politely. They already declined my letters. Mercer's eyes narrowed. What letters? I sent 4 certified notices over 14 months. The younger executive beside Mercer visibly stiffened. Corporate correspondence involving property liability normally passed through multiple internal filters before reaching the executive level. If letters had been ignored, somebody inside the company had either buried them intentionally or assumed the sender lacked resources to pursue litigation. Mercer extended his hand abruptly. Let me see the documents. Walter hesitated just long enough for the refusal to register emotionally before handing over the top folder. Mercer opened it impatiently. Inside rested photocopies of county transfer records, handwritten easement agreements, and a faded contract bearing the signature of Charles Mercer. The CEO's expression hardened immediately. Not panic. Not fear. Recognition. Walter saw it happen. So did the executives. Mercer flipped through the pages faster, but the speed itself revealed discomfort. Powerful executives read slowly when confident and quickly when cornered. Walter had spent 40 years negotiating agricultural leases and municipal water rights across 3 counties. He understood body language better than most attorneys. This agreement expired decades ago, Mercer said sharply. Walter shook his head. Only if development began within the specified timeline. It did begin. No, sir. Preliminary grading began. Commercial occupancy never did. That interpretation wouldn't survive arbitration. Walter's voice remained polite. That's why I filed for declaratory review instead. One executive whispered a curse beneath his breath. Mercer looked up instantly. Filed where? Cook County Civil Division. When? Yesterday morning. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bend the air. Several employees nearby quietly walked away. Nobody wanted to witness whatever happened next. Mercer closed the folder slowly now, no longer pretending the issue was insignificant. You came here to threaten me publicly? Walter answered carefully. No. I came here because your father once gave me his word. Mercer's jaw tightened. My father has been dead for 15 years. Walter nodded once. I know. I attended the funeral. That sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Mercer stared at him differently now, searching memory instead of dismissing inconvenience. Walter's face remained deeply lined with age, but there was something steady about him, something difficult to intimidate. Men who spent their lives needing approval usually looked away under pressure. Walter never did. You knew him? Mercer asked. Yes. How? Walter glanced toward the massive windows overlooking the river. Before your company existed, your father ran supply operations for regional bridge construction. Back then, banks still refused financing after the steel recession. Contractors were collapsing everywhere. Mercer said nothing. Your father needed temporary land access near North River for equipment staging, Walter continued. My family owned adjacent industrial property through green rail storage. He couldn't secure city permits without crossing our parcel. One executive frowned. Green rail storage went bankrupt in the 90s. Walter nodded calmly. After my brother died. The room fell silent again. Mercer returned his attention to the contract pages. This says easement rights transferred conditionally in exchange for future equity consideration. They did. You're claiming ownership shares? No. Mercer looked genuinely surprised. Walter folded his hands together. I'm claiming enforcement. That single word changed the emotional balance completely. Equity disputes could often be settled quietly with money. Enforcement meant operational consequences. Delays. Injunctions. Public filings. Investors. Regulatory review. Mercer understood immediately. How much do you want? He asked. Walter almost smiled at the predictability of the question. Your father asked me the same thing once, he replied. Mercer's irritation returned instantly. Then give me the answer you gave him. Walter looked directly into his eyes. I told him some agreements shouldn't be measured in dollars. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mercer handed the documents back abruptly. You're exploiting a technicality attached to expired industrial land. Walter accepted the folder carefully. No, sir. Your company built a $30 million transportation hub on property connected to a surviving access covenant. That covenant has no commercial standing today. Walter tilted his head slightly. Your attorney should already know whether that statement is true. Mercer turned toward one of his executives. Get Rebecca Lynn downstairs. Now. The executive immediately hurried toward the elevators. Walter watched quietly. Mercer crossed his arms. You understand what happens if this filing becomes public before verification? Yes. You could trigger financing complications. Yes. Pension funds are attached to North River. I know. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice. Then why force this confrontation? Walter's expression changed for the first time since entering the building. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Disappointment. Because I spent 14 months trying not to. The elevator doors opened sharply across the lobby. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped out carrying a tablet and several printed files. Rebecca Lynn, Hartwell Infrastructure's chief legal officer, moved quickly toward the group while scanning internal messages. Daniel, she said immediately, I just reviewed the county filing. Mercer did not look away from Walter. And? Rebecca hesitated. That hesitation told everyone everything. The petition references surviving contingent development clauses tied to the original Mercer Transit acquisition, she said carefully. If authenticated, opposing counsel could seek temporary construction review. One executive muttered, Jesus Christ. Mercer finally exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he asked the question he should have asked from the beginning. What exactly do you want, Mr. Green? Walter held the folder firmly beneath one arm. Not what, he answered quietly. Who? Rebecca Lynn led them into a private executive conference room overlooking the Chicago River 30 floors below. The room itself reflected the culture Daniel Mercer had built around him over the last decade, minimalist furniture, dark walnut walls, silent integrated screens, and a polished steel table large enough to make every meeting feel adversarial before discussion even began. Walter Green entered last, carrying the same weathered leather folder while younger executives avoided eye contact with him entirely. Mercer remained standing. "I want this conversation protected under preliminary legal review," he said sharply to Rebecca. She nodded once. "Internal confidentiality applies, but anything disclosed outside formal counsel could still become discoverable later." Mercer looked irritated by the reminder. Powerful executives preferred authority without procedural limitations. Attorneys existed to explain limitations after the damage had already started. Walter took a seat slowly near the end of the table. "I'm not here to embarrass your company." Mercer sat across from him. "That's difficult to believe." "Then believe this instead," Walter replied calmly. "If I wanted publicity, reporters would already know about the filing." Rebecca opened her tablet. "Mr. Green, before we proceed further, I need clarification regarding representation. Are you working through outside counsel?" "Yes." "Who?" Walter answered without hesitation. "Elaine Porter." Rebecca's posture shifted instantly. Mercer noticed. "What?" Rebecca looked directly at him. "Porter handled the St. Louis municipal fraud settlement 3 years ago." "The transit case?" "Yes." Mercer leaned back slowly. Even he recognized the name now. Elaine Porter had built a reputation dismantling corporate concealment strategies during infrastructure disputes. She rarely accepted weak cases because contingency litigation at her level required enormous financial risk. "She took this case?" Mercer asked. Walter nodded. Rebecca spoke carefully. "That suggests she believes the underlying contractual chain survived merger consolidation." Mercer's expression darkened. "Or she believes we'll settle quietly." Walter folded his hands together. "Your father never settled quietly." The room became still again. Mercer stared at him. "You keep talking about my father like you knew him personally." "I did." "No," Mercer said flatly. "You knew the version of him that existed before success." Walter considered the statement for a moment. "Success changes memory faster than character." Mercer looked away toward the river. Rebecca intervened before the silence hardened further. "Mr. Green, the petition references a surviving conditional covenant connected to Green Rail Storage. However, the original corporation dissolved in 1994. We'll need explanation regarding standing." Walter opened the leather folder again. This time he removed a smaller envelope secured with a faded brass clasp. "My brother Daniel handled the company finances before he died," Walter said quietly. "After the bankruptcy, everyone assumed the remaining records disappeared during liquidation." He slid several documents across the table. "They didn't." Rebecca immediately began reading. Mercer watched her face instead of the papers. That alone told Walter which person in the room truly understood danger. "These are transfer continuations," Rebecca murmured. Walter nodded. "The county archived them incorrectly under agricultural conversion filings instead of industrial easements." Mercer frowned impatiently. "Speak English." Rebecca inhaled carefully before answering. "The covenant may have remained active because the property classification changed during bankruptcy restructuring." Mercer stared at her. "You told me all acquisition liabilities were extinguished." Rebecca kept her eyes on the paperwork. "Most were." "Most?" She finally looked up. "Daniel, this merger happened before digital indexing standards. If these filings were buried under misclassified county records, due diligence teams may never have reviewed them." Walter spoke softly. "Your father did." Mercer's jaw tightened again. "You keep implying he hid this intentionally." Walter shook his head slowly. "No. I'm saying he planned to honor it." Mercer laughed once without humor. "Honor what exactly?" Walter reached into the folder one final time and removed a single handwritten letter protected inside a transparent sleeve. Unlike the legal documents, this paper showed visible age, creases at the folds, fading ink, slight water damage along one edge. My father kept this in his safe until he died, Walter said. After my brother passed, I inherited it. He slid the letter toward Mercer. Rebecca remained silent as Mercer unfolded it carefully. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Charles Mercer. Daniel recognized it immediately. The room stayed quiet while he read. Halfway through the page, his expression changed. Not anger. Not irritation. Something closer to confusion. Walter watched him closely. Your father wrote that after the county denied his emergency financing request in 1987. Mercer continued reading silently. He promised, Walter said, that if the North River Corridor ever became commercially viable again, our families would complete the development together. Mercer lowered the paper slowly. This isn't legally binding. No, Walter agreed. The contract is. Rebecca spoke carefully. Daniel, there's another issue. Mercer looked toward her impatiently. She turned the tablet screen around. A highlighted section from the original covenant appeared enlarged across the display. Conditional development participation rights, she read aloud quietly. Upon activation of permanent commercial occupancy, secondary landholder retains authority to appoint operational oversight representative during initial infrastructure implementation phase. Mercer frowned. What does that mean? Rebecca hesitated. Walter answered instead. It means, he said evenly, that before your transportation hub becomes fully operational, my family retains contractual authority to review compliance decisions tied to the original land agreement. One executive near the far wall whispered, that can't be real. Rebecca did not contradict him. Mercer stared at Walter for several long seconds. You said you weren't asking for money. I'm not. Then what are you asking for? Walter's eyes remained steady. My grandson. Mercer blinked once. What? My grandson submitted engineering applications to your company 3 times in the last 2 years. Rebecca glanced down at another file immediately, already understanding where the conversation was going. He graduated top of his program, Walter continued. Civil infrastructure. Structural transit systems. Interned with State Transportation Review. But Hartwell rejected him every time before final interview. Mercer crossed his arms defensively. I don't personally review entry-level hiring. No, Walter said quietly. Your algorithms do. The room stayed silent. Walter continued carefully, never raising his voice. My grandson's name is Isaac Green. During automated screening, your hiring system flagged his family bankruptcy history tied to green rail storage. Rebecca's expression tightened slightly. Mercer noticed immediately. That's impossible. Rebecca answered before Walter could. Not impossible. Some legacy risk screening models still incorporate financial lineage indicators for compliance scoring. Mercer looked stunned. You're telling me we reject applicants because relatives lost businesses 30 years ago? No, Rebecca said carefully. I'm saying the system may reduce advancement probability during early filtering. Rain began striking the conference room windows in slow, uneven patterns while nobody inside the room spoke. 30 floors below, evening traffic crawled through downtown Chicago beneath reflections of construction cranes and unfinished steel framing. Hartwell Infrastructure had spent years branding the North River redevelopment as a symbol of economic renewal. Investors praised it during earnings calls. Politicians toured the site wearing hard hats for local news cameras. Yet inside the executive conference room, the entire project suddenly felt fragile. Daniel Mercer placed his father's letter on the table carefully. You filed a civil petition, he said at last. Over a hiring rejection? Walter Green shook his head immediately. No. I filed because your company forgot the difference between efficiency and judgment. Mercer leaned back in his chair. That's a philosophical argument, not a legal one. Walter answered calmly. The legal argument is already sitting in front of your attorney. Rebecca Lynn continued reviewing the archived covenant language silently. The deeper she read, the more cautious her posture became. She had spent nearly 15 years protecting corporations from regulatory exposure, but experience taught her one dangerous truth: old agreements caused the worst damage because modern executives assumed forgotten obligations no longer mattered. Mercer looked toward her again. How serious is this? Rebecca chose her words carefully. If the court grants temporary review authority, construction lenders could pause disbursement until ownership participation rights are clarified. One executive near the wall exhaled sharply. That would freeze the transit phase. Potentially, Rebecca replied. Mercer stood abruptly and walked toward the windows. His reflection stared back from the glass, tailored suit, silver watch, controlled expression. The image investors trusted completely. Yet Walter noticed something different now. Mercer no longer moved like a man dismissing inconvenience. He moved like someone reconstructing memory against his will. My father never mentioned this family, Mercer said quietly. Walter remained seated. Your father mentioned very few people after the company grew. That's not an answer. No, Walter replied softly. It's context. Mercer turned around. Then give me the answer. Walter studied him for a moment before speaking. In 1987, your father was close to losing everything. The room stayed silent. Banks had frozen regional lending after 2 bridge contractors defaulted, Walter continued. Your father needed temporary industrial access near North River or his transportation bid would collapse before permit approval. Mercer crossed his arms again defensively. And you helped him? Yes. Why? Walter looked down briefly at the old leather folder. Because my brother believed people deserved one honest chance before judgment became permanent. Rebecca glanced toward Walter carefully. Something in his tone had changed. My brother Daniel handled our company operations, Walter continued. Numbers, contracts, equipment leasing. I handled field logistics. We weren't wealthy men, but we owned enough land access to solve your father's permit problem. Mercer remained standing near the windows. Walter continued speaking steadily. Your father promised partnership participation once the corridor became commercially active. Not charity. Not gifts. Opportunity. And then your company collapsed. Walter nodded once. 3 years later. What happened? For the first time since entering the building, Walter hesitated before answering. My brother trusted the wrong lender. Rebecca stopped typing. Mercer said nothing. Walter folded his hands together slowly. During the recession, a regional bank offered emergency restructuring loans to small industrial operators. They assured Daniel the financing would stabilize equipment debt while public transportation contracts recovered. Mercer's expression hardened slightly. He already recognized where the story was going. The bank changed terms 6 months later, Walter said quietly. Interest adjustments. Accelerated collateral triggers. Legal fees added into principal balances. Rebecca spoke softly. Cross-default leverage. Walter nodded. By the time attorneys reviewed the documents, Green Rail Storage owed more in penalties than original debt. Mercer stared at him carefully now. My brother spent 2 years trying to save the company, Walter continued. Then one morning he drove to the rail yard before sunrise and suffered a heart attack alone inside the maintenance office. Nobody moved. Walter's voice never broke, but the restraint inside it carried more weight than visible grief. He died believing he failed everyone connected to him. Rain continued tapping the windows behind Mercer. And your grandson? Mercer asked quietly. My grandson grew up hearing our family once built something important before losing it, Walter answered. He studied engineering because he wanted to work on infrastructure projects that actually helped people. Rebecca lowered her tablet slowly. Walter looked directly at Mercer. He applied to your company because he admired what North River could become. Mercer rubbed his jaw once. You could have contacted me privately. Walter almost smiled sadly. I tried. Rebecca glanced toward Mercer again. Daniel, she said carefully, compliance archives confirm 4 certified letters addressed to executive review. Mercer's eyes narrowed immediately. Who screened them? Rebecca checked the records. Administrative escalation filtered them under inactive liability claims before legal review. One employee made that decision. Likely automated categorization. Mercer laughed once under his breath, though nothing about the sound carried humor. Walter watched him closely. Systems make rejection feel impersonal. That's why corporations prefer them. Mercer turned back toward the table. You think this is revenge? Walter answered without hesitation. No. Revenge would involve destroying the project. Then what is this? A reminder. Mercer looked genuinely frustrated now. Of what? That institution stops seeing human beings when profit becomes the only language left. Silence settled heavily across the room again. One executive finally spoke from the far side of the table. Daniel, even if the covenant survives preliminary review, we can still negotiate financial settlement. Walter shook his head immediately. I told you already. This isn't about money. The executive looked confused. Then why threaten the project? Walter's eyes moved toward the rain-covered skyline outside the windows. Because powerful people only slow down when something expensive might break. Nobody answered him. Mercer returned slowly to his chair. Suppose I offer your grandson a position tomorrow. Walter studied him carefully. That would solve your public relations problem, he said. Not your actual one. And what exactly is the actual problem? Walter leaned forward slightly for the first time all evening. Your company inherited more than land from your father, he said quietly. It inherited unfinished obligations. Mercer stared back at him. Walter continued. Charles Mercer believed infrastructure existed to rebuild struggling communities after the recession. That was the entire purpose of the North River Corridor. Affordable freight access. Local manufacturing recovery. Public transit expansion. Mercer looked down at the handwritten letter again. Walter's voice remained steady. Somewhere along the way, your company stopped building communities and started extracting value from them. Rebecca said nothing because she knew he was partially right. Mercer finally spoke after several long seconds. You think I built this company without responsibility? Walter answered carefully. I think you built it without ever hearing the word no. The statement landed harder than shouting would have. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Mercer leaned back slowly, studying the old man across from him. For the first time, irritation faded from his face entirely. In its place appeared something much more dangerous to a man like him. Uncertainty. Then Rebecca's phone vibrated sharply against the conference table. She checked the screen. Her expression changed immediately. Daniel, she said quietly, the county filing just became public. The room froze. And? Mercer asked. Rebecca looked directly at him. 3 lenders already requested emergency clarification regarding project ownership exposure. Outside the conference room, phones began ringing almost simultaneously across the executive floor. The crisis had officially started. Within 20 minutes, the executive floor transformed from controlled corporate order into quiet institutional panic. Assistants moved rapidly between offices carrying printed briefing packets while legal analysts crowded outside conference rooms speaking in low, urgent voices. Large companies rarely collapse dramatically in a single moment. Damage usually began with uncertainty, then spread through lenders, investors, regulators, and political partners like cracks moving through frozen glass. Walter Green watched the process unfold from inside the conference room without satisfaction. He had seen financial fear before. Banks wore confidence publicly until risk became visible on paper. Daniel Mercer remained at the head of the table reviewing incoming messages from board members demanding explanations. The North River redevelopment represented nearly 40% of Hartwell Infrastructure's projected 5-year expansion strategy. Even temporary delays could trigger catastrophic market reactions. Rebecca Lynn entered new updates into her tablet continuously. 2 lenders suspended tonight's scheduled authorization review, she said. The city transportation office also requested emergency clarification. Mercer rubbed both hands across his face once. How long before this reaches financial media? Possibly within the hour. One executive muttered another curse quietly. Walter finally stood from his chair. I should leave. Mercer looked up immediately. You think you can walk into my company, trigger lender panic, and disappear? Walter answered calmly. I didn't trigger panic. Your contracts did. Mercer stared at him for several seconds before speaking again. Sit down. Walter remained standing anyway. You still don't understand why I came here, he said quietly. Mercer laughed bitterly. Then explain it clearly. Walter looked around the conference room slowly. Everyone in this building thinks the danger started today. It did. No, Walter replied. Today is simply the first moment you noticed it. Rebecca stopped typing again. Walter continued carefully. For 14 months I waited for someone inside this company to review those records honestly. Every letter disappeared into systems designed to protect executives from uncomfortable information. Mercer's voice sharpened. That's how corporations function. Walter nodded once. Exactly. Silence settled across the room again. Walter picked up the leather folder. My grandson asked me something after his third rejection. Mercer said nothing. He asked whether our family name carried some hidden stain nobody would explain to him. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. Walter continued. Imagine watching someone intelligent begin believing failure is inherited. Mercer leaned back heavily in his chair. You still could have contacted me directly. Walter almost smiled sadly. Mr. Mercer, powerful men always believe access exists until they become inaccessible themselves. Nobody answered him. A younger executive suddenly spoke from near the windows. Daniel, market analysts are already discussing possible injunction exposure online. Mercer ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at Walter. What happens if the court sides with you? Walter answered honestly. Temporary operational review. Potential construction suspension. Renegotiation of covenant participation rights. And if I fight it? Rebecca responded before Walter could. Discovery proceedings begin. Mercer looked toward her sharply. She continued carefully. Historical acquisition records, merger due diligence archives, internal liability screenings, executive communications regarding ignored notices, everything becomes reviewable. One executive whispered, Jesus. Mercer stood again and walked toward the windows, but this time his posture looked older somehow. Less controlled. The city lights reflected across the glass around him while rain streaked downward like fractures. My father built this company from almost nothing, he said quietly. Walter answered from behind him. Yes. He worked every hour available. Yes. He taught me survival. Walter nodded slowly. I believe he did. Mercer turned around sharply. Then stopped talking like I betrayed him. Walter's expression remained calm. Did you ever read the original North River proposal? Mercer frowned. Of course. The first one, Walter clarified. Before investors rewrote it. Mercer did not answer immediately. Walter already understood. My brother kept a copy, he said softly. Your father wanted Union freight yards reopened. Affordable warehouse leasing for local operators. Reduced permit barriers for independent contractors returning after the recession. Rebecca listened silently now. Walter continued. He believed infrastructure should create ownership opportunities for working families, not just shareholder growth. Mercer crossed his arms again. That world doesn't exist anymore. Walter looked directly at him. Only because people with power decided it was inefficient. The statement lingered heavily in the room. Then Rebecca's phone vibrated once more. She checked the screen and immediately inhaled sharply. What now? Mercer asked. The City Council Transportation Committee scheduled an emergency hearing tomorrow morning. One executive cursed openly this time. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Of course they did. Rebecca looked uneasy. Daniel, if public officials think ownership rights were overlooked during redevelopment approval, they may pause occupancy certification until clarification. That could delay the entire launch. Yes. Mercer stared down at the table silently for several long seconds. Then he looked at Walter again. "What would your father have done?" he asked quietly. Walter seemed surprised by the question. After a moment, he answered. "He would have sat down before things reached this point." Mercer almost laughed, though exhaustion had replaced arrogance now. "You think this can still be fixed with a conversation?" "No," Walter said honestly. "I think it can only be fixed with accountability." Nobody spoke. Finally Mercer walked slowly back toward the table and picked up his father's handwritten letter again. This time he read the final paragraph aloud quietly enough that only the people in the room could hear. "Communities remember who helped them survive hard years. If North River ever stands again, it should belong partly to the people who kept it alive when banks abandoned it." The room stayed silent afterward. Walter watched Mercer carefully. For the first time all evening, the CEO no longer looked defensive. He looked tired. Not physically tired. Morally tired. Mercer folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the protective sleeve. Then he asked the question nobody expected. "What's your grandson's full name?" Walter answered immediately. "Isaac Green." Rebecca typed quickly into her tablet. A moment later she looked up. "Civil Engineering Honors Graduate. State Infrastructure Fellowship. 3 rejected applications over 18 months. Mercer frowned. "Why rejected?" Rebecca hesitated. "Internal candidate risk scoring." Mercer's jaw tightened again. "Based on what?" Rebecca looked uncomfortable now. "Legacy financial instability indicators tied to family bankruptcy records." The room became completely still. Mercer spoke very quietly. "We built a hiring system that punishes descendants for inherited economic collapse." Nobody answered him because nobody could defend it honestly. Walter finally picked up the leather folder again. "My grandson believes companies like yours only value people already connected to power," he said softly. "I came here because I wanted one executive to understand what that belief costs." Mercer stared down at the table for a very long time. Then the CEO of Hartwell Infrastructure made the first truly unscripted decision anyone in the company had seen from him in years. He looked toward Rebecca. "Prepare a public statement." Every executive in the room froze. Rebecca blinked once. "About the filing?" "No," Mercer said quietly. "About the truth." Nobody in the conference room moved after Daniel Mercer said the words. Years inside large corporations trained executives to recognize danger instantly, and public honesty ranked near the top of every institutional threat list. Rebecca Lynn stared at Mercer carefully, trying to determine whether exhaustion had temporarily overridden his judgment. A public statement admitting contractual exposure would devastate investor confidence, one executive warned immediately. Mercer looked toward him calmly. "Investor confidence is already collapsing. We can still contain this." "No," Mercer replied quietly. "We can contain headlines. We can't contain records." Walter Green remained silent near the end of the table, still holding the worn leather folder beneath one arm. He had entered the building expecting resistance, negotiation, maybe settlement pressure. He had not expected reflection. Rebecca spoke cautiously. "Daniel, before issuing anything public, we need to consider fiduciary obligations to shareholders." Mercer nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm doing." The room fell silent again. He turned toward the windows overlooking North River. Rain still moved across the glass in thin silver streaks while cranes stood frozen against the dark skyline. Millions of dollars waited below for occupancy approval. Hundreds of workers depended on the project continuing without delay. For years Mercer believed leadership meant never appearing uncertain in front of other people. Yet standing there now, he understood something his father apparently learned decades earlier: institutions failed long before bankruptcy whenever honesty became incompatible with survival. "When I took over after my father died," Mercer said quietly, "everyone around me talked about scale. Expansion. Market dominance. Efficiency." Nobody interrupted him. "So I built systems designed to eliminate risk faster than competitors could." Walter watched him carefully. Mercer continued. "Every acquisition became numbers. Every delay became liability. Every applicant became data. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly because she had helped design many of those systems herself. Mercer looked back toward Walter. Your grandson never met a human being inside my company before rejection. No, Walter replied softly. He didn't. Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose. That should bother me more than it used to. One executive shifted impatiently. Daniel, with respect, this is becoming emotional instead of strategic. Mercer turned toward him sharply. That's the reason we're here. The executive said nothing afterward. Rebecca finally spoke again. What exactly do you want the statement to say? Mercer answered without hesitation this time. That Hartwell Infrastructure is temporarily suspending North River occupancy certification review pending independent contractual verification. Several executives reacted immediately. That alone could trigger stock decline. It probably will, Mercer replied. Walter studied him quietly. And after verification? Mercer looked directly at him for the first time without defensiveness anywhere in his face. After verification, he said, we honor the agreement. The room became still. One executive actually laughed in disbelief. You can't be serious. Mercer's voice hardened instantly. My father made a promise connected to this land before most of you entered the industry. That promise is an enforceable sentiment. No, Mercer agreed. The contract is. Silence returned again. Rebecca closed the tablet slowly. If we proceed this way, lenders will demand restructuring guarantees. Then we negotiate them honestly. The board may oppose that. Mercer almost smiled. For once, they can oppose me in person instead of through consultants. Walter noticed something subtle then. The confidence surrounding Mercer had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Earlier that evening, it came from control. Now it came from acceptance. Mercer walked back toward the table and extended the handwritten letter toward Walter carefully. My father should have told me about your family himself, he said. Walter accepted the letter gently. He probably intended to. Mercer nodded once. Intentions seem to expire faster than contracts. A faint smile crossed Walter's face for the first time all night. Rebecca gathered several documents together. I'll coordinate with outside counsel before the market opens. Mercer looked toward her. And remove the legacy financial scoring model from recruitment review immediately. Rebecca blinked once. Tonight? Tonight. She nodded slowly. Walter adjusted the old leather folder beneath his arm. My grandson doesn't need favors, Mr. Mercer. Mercer answered quietly. I know. Then don't hire him because of guilt. Mercer considered the statement carefully before replying. What if I hire him because the system rejected someone qualified for the wrong reason? Walter looked at him for several long seconds. Then he nodded once. Outside the conference room, phones continued ringing across the executive floor while legal teams prepared for the longest night Hartwell Infrastructure had faced in years. Markets would react. Reporters would speculate. Investors would panic temporarily because uncertainty frightened financial institutions more than truth ever could. But inside the conference room, something else had already happened. For the first time in decades, a company built on aggressive expansion had been forced to stop moving long enough to remember the people buried underneath its foundations. Walter walked toward the conference room door slowly. Before leaving, he turned back one final time. Your father wasn't ashamed of struggling people, he said quietly. He was afraid of becoming someone who forgot them. Mercer stood motionless beside the windows overlooking North River. When Walter finally disappeared into the executive hallway, nobody followed him. Because the old man no longer looked small inside the building. The building looked small around him.